Our next speaker is Adrian Day. Adrian Day is a recognized authority in both global and resource investing. He's a frequent speaker at conferences worldwide where he provides his deep understanding of macroeconomics and political trends. His passion for liberty underpins his understanding of the world and what happens when it is diminished. He has authored 2 books on the subject of global investing, international investing opportunities, how and where to invest overseas successfully, and investing without borders. Mr. Day's topic of the day is Capitalism without Chimneys, Individualism, Liberty and Land Rights in Medieval England. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Adrian Day.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're really quite eclectic conference this morning. Eh? We've talked about Israel, we've talked about sex education, now we're going to talk about medieval England. Why, you may ask, are we talking about medieval England? Well, I'm going to make the case that there was a great deal for the mass of people in medieval England. There was a great deal of liberty, and that liberty was based on a sense of individualism, it was based on land rights, and it was based on a free market economic system, all of which is contrary to common perception, and indeed the liberty in the Middle Ages was far greater in most cases, or in many cases, than what came afterwards. Now, last year when Hungary proposed a so-called anti-gay law, a European official fulminated, "We don't live in the Middle Ages anymore." If you look up the word medieval in the dictionary and you see barbaric, backward, as the meaning, as, for example, a New Zealand website reporting that residents in the far north are frustrated at their medieval cell phone coverage. And of course, the very word Dark Ages doesn't need any explaining. So the question is, was the medieval period really that bad? Should medieval be used as a slur? And were the Dark Ages really so dark? Now, I'm not pretending, of course, that England in the medieval period was a libertarian paradise. But I am arguing that common perception is wrong, and I'm also going to argue, and we'll come across this theme many times, that history does not always go forward. History frequently goes backwards, particularly when we talk about freedom. So first of all, definitions. Definitions are always important, and they're actually a little imprecise, and they've been changing with regard to the terms Dark Ages and so on. When we talk about the period after the fall of Rome until the Italian Renaissance, that's a period of 1,000 years. The term Dark Ages was first used by Petrarch, who hungered for the glories of ancient Rome and used the term as a contrast. The term Middle Ages was first used in the 16th century simply to separate the ancient world from the then modern world. But 1,000 years is obviously an awfully long time to lump together. We'd not think today of talking about the period from 1000 to 2000 as one period of time. And no more should we think of the period of the Middle Ages from 450 to 1450 roughly, the fall of Rome to the Italian Renaissance, as one period. More and more historians are talking about, use the term the Dark Ages for the period after the fall of Rome until about the 8th century. And even that, frankly, is not, I think that to use the word Dark Ages is not appropriate. After that, we have the early Middle Ages, and then we have the high Middle Ages, which come immediately before the Italian Renaissance, as I say, starting in the 15th century. Still, even if we only talk about the medieval period after the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, we still have a vast period. And clearly, the 9th century was not the same as the 15th century. Equally, we have a vast area, and I'm only talking about Europe. We're going to, there's very little to connect, let's say, 10th century China with 10th century civilizations in Latin America. So I'm only talking about Europe, but even there, if you look at medieval England, look at medieval Russia, we're looking at completely different systems. Now, before I get into the topic of a talk, I think it's important to emphasize that views among historians have changed quite a lot, quite significantly, over the last 50 years, over the last 100 years, but particularly the last 50 years. And there's a lot of debate among historians about some fundamental issues. And so the views I'm going to outline here are certainly different from the consensus views 50 years ago when I studied medieval England at university, and they're not necessarily a consensus view today. And you should read some books on different aspects of medieval society to realize just how contentious and how heated these debates can get. But I think it's also true to say that more and more we're recognizing, historians, but the massive population, we're realizing that the medieval period was really not some hiatus between the glory of Rome and the glories of the Italian Renaissance, but instead there was really astounding advances throughout that entire period in many fields during the long Middle Ages. I think in art, which is what we think of when we think of Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, we think first of all of art. Perhaps art was the least of the subjects that advanced during the Middle Ages. But, historians talk about the 12th century Renaissance, which obviously is a long time before what we typically think of as the Renaissance. C.S. Lewis went even further, and Lewis said that the Renaissance was simply the last chapter of the medieval period. The Renaissance was the culmination of the Middle Ages. So misconceptions, as I said, and errors abound. You ask most people what they think about medieval. You ask most people, and they would say that in the Middle Ages, people thought the world was flat, the earth was flat. And it wasn't until explorers like Magellan and Columbus proved them wrong. That's just absolutely, completely false. There was no halfway educated person who thought the earth was flat going as far back as the 8th or 7th century. It's just nonsense to say that in the Middle Ages people thought the world was flat. They had debates over how big the world was. They had debates over, or they tried to work out what the precise circumference of the earth was, but nobody thought the world was flat. This is just nonsense. If you look at various fields, engineering, philosophy, culture, science in the medieval period, you find amazing areas of light. Most obviously, or most easily recognizable perhaps, would be the Gothic cathedrals. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that when I go into an 11th century Gothic cathedral today, it is still awe-inspiring. It is truly awe-inspiring to think that these buildings were constructed over 1,000 years ago. And indeed, the Gothic cathedrals were the tallest man-made buildings well into the late 19th century. Lincoln Cathedral in England, which was commenced in the 1000s. It was commenced in the 1000s, so that's 1,000 years ago. Stands at 524 feet, And that was, other than Minster, which was 530 feet, those two were the tallest structures in Europe until the Eiffel Tower was built in the 1880s. Again, we think commonly of medieval churchmen. We think that the church crushed all examination of science, that it was anti-science, and we think about medieval churchmen, and most of the learning in the Middle Ages was by monks, that is true. We think that they were concerned with how many angels dance on the head of a pin. Again, that's another complete anachronism. No one has been able to see anywhere in any medieval literature where people are talking about, where people are arguing about that subject. Now, Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the greatest churchmen of all time, and a saint in the Catholic Church, he did indeed write volumes on the mysteries of transubstantiation, the mysteries of the Trinity, which many of us today would think are a little arcane, shall we say. But he also wrote very profound books on philosophy, such as the thin volume on Being and Essence, which I think is arguably the greatest work on philosophy since Aristotle. Again, as I said, there's a sense that the church, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, crushed any scholarship on science. It's not true. The church in the Middle Ages was a great supporter of science. They saw science and religion as two different but compatible fields. Remember, God created the universe, and the feeling was that the more we understand the universe, then the more we understand God. And so the church encouraged the monks. It encouraged learning of the universe. And where experience, practical experience, contradicted the literal word in the scripture, then scholars saw no need to take the biblical descriptions literally. Now, some people will say Galileo. Galileo, I remind you, worked in the 17th century. That is a long time after the Middle Ages, after the medieval period. And it's another example, which I'll keep coming back to, of how history doesn't always move in a straight line. We can have freedoms in one area, in one era, that we lose in the next. Again, learning in Western Christian Europe was not closed. It was not intolerant at all. It was during the Middle Ages that we saw the revival of Greek, ancient Greek thought, which was pagan, of course, and the introduction of Arab thought, which was Muslim, of course. And Thomas Aquinas, again, one of the greatest churchmen and a saint of the Catholic Church, was prime among those who introduced, or reintroduced Greek thought, I should say, and introduced Arabic thought into the West. And it's really interesting, you know, and it became almost a fad in the Middle Ages. So Christian scholars would flock to areas where Muslims and Christians interacted, like southern Spain and Sicily, and they'd search out the latest Arabic theories. It became as I say, a bit of a fad. And it was very, very fashionable when scholars wrote textbooks and wrote up their theories. It was very fashionable to throw in Arabic buzzwords and jargon to make them seem more advanced. It was also in this period, of course, that the universities were founded in the 11th century, many of which survive to this day. We also saw huge advances in mathematics, in other scientific areas, particularly astronomy. This era had the first mechanical clocks. It also had, most people don't know this, but there were alarm clocks in the 12th century. And the first alarm clock was invented in a monastery, and it was given to the monk whose task it was to wake up all the other monks for the early morning matins. And it was not easy waking up at 4 o'clock to celebrate matins. So they invented an alarm clock that this monk had, and they rang a bell to wake him up. And And many of these clocks are actually not only incredibly accurate, but they're also very complicated. There are medieval clocks that show not just the 24-hour clock where each hour is equal, but they also show the solar time. I don't know if most people know this is a tangent, but I didn't know it actually until I was doing some research on clocks and time. But up until the 12th century, people did not see each hour of the day as an equal period of time. So the hours in the evening, there were still 24 hours in a day, but the hours in the evening in the summer were longer than the hours in the morning, and they were longer than those same hours were in the middle of winter. They weren't all, as it were, 60 minutes. It was only in the 12th century that people started looking at hours. They started looking at the day as 24 equal hours. And so in the Middle Ages, you have clocks that have both sets of time on the same clock, which when you think about it is really quite advanced. Anyone interested in this, by the way, I would refer them to a wonderful book. Seb Falk is the name. It's called The Light Ages, and it's just a fascinating book on the advance of science in the Middle Ages, and extremely well written. So the common perception also, of course, is that life was poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and no question, broadly speaking, it was, compared with where we are today. The other image we have of the Middle Ages, of course, is of handsome knights in shining armor, protecting beautiful damsels who sit in their castles all day long embroidering. And that latter view feeds into the general romanticized view of an idyllic pre-industrial society, where society is in harmony, as young maidens frolic around the maypole. And this view became very popular in the early 19th century after the horrors of the French Revolution and after the grime of the Industrial Revolution. And the Romantics, there was a whole Romantic movement, which many of you know about. The Romantics longed for pre-industrial society, and along with that, with no industry, but also they disliked the rationalism of the Enlightenment. And this sort of general view that pre-industrial society was somehow better for people, it does reemerge occasionally. Today it's quite common among traditionalist Catholics, among others. Now the truth, of course, is somewhere in between. It's a little of each and it's somewhere in between. Certainly life was short. Child mortality was extremely high. There was a strong dependence on nature for a lot of people. For a lot of people, a single harvest failure led to famine. Plagues were frequent. Medical treatment was very rudimentary and often wrong. And so on and so on and so on. On the other hand, I think it's true to say that in the medieval period, there was a greater sense of harmony in society. There were more shared values and more things that were taken for granted. And in a society, I think that can have a benefit. But I'll also say, as I've referred to already, the common perception, which is the Whig view of history, that things always move forward over time. You have a few setbacks, but things move forward over time and improve. That is, broadly speaking, true when we're looking at living standards. You know, there's no question that even the poorest person today in Britain or Canada, it has a living standard that in most ways is far better than that, not only of monarchs who lived in the Middle Ages, but just of their grandparents and great-grandparents. So, and I think we don't recognize that enough, frankly. That's a whole different topic that we could talk about at this conference at some point. But in other areas, it's not at all self-evident that things get better all the time. You know, I briefly touched on the idea of doctrine and science in the medieval period compared with the post-Reformation period. Excuse me. Another issue might be women's rights. If I don't run out of time, I'll talk about this a little bit later on. But if we broadly progressed with regard to the standing of women in society over the last 150 years, although maybe the last 10 years with transgenders invading women's sports, we've gone backwards. But if we broadly progressed, we sort of assume that if it was worse 100 years ago, it must have been far, far worse 1,000 years ago. That's simply not true. And I'm going to touch on the standing of women in medieval period to illustrate this. Again, to quote Seb Falk, he says, progress can stop and it can go into reverse. So let's now look a little bit at England. How am I doing on time, Giant? I don't have a watch.
10 more minutes.
Is that it? Oh my gosh. I haven't even started yet. So I'm now going to talk about England in the medieval period. Very important to recognize that English society in the Middle Ages was different from European society. England was not a feudal society. Feudalism did not penetrate into English society the way it did in what is now France and Germany and most other continental societies, particularly Poland and Eastern Europe. We talk about the Peasants' Revolt in the 13th century. That expression was not used until the 19th century. English farmers were not called peasants, as I say, all the way up until the 19th century. And the reason they weren't called peasants is because they were not peasants, because we didn't have feudalism. In many ways, I'm arguing the medieval society in England was quite modern, but it was quite libertarian, and it was quite capitalist. And there are various aspects to this. First of all, the individual was much more important than the group. If you're in a feudal society, the group becomes the dominant. It might be a small group, it might be an extended family, but the group becomes the most important aspect. If you don't have feudalism, you have the opportunity for the individual to be more important. We had a legal system that was based, the English common law, as opposed to the Roman system, the Roman law, that was based on the rights of individual. That's what common law is all about. It's about the rights of the individual, not the duties of the individual, not the rights of groups. We had a market economy, and I'll come to this in a second. We had very, very strong land ownership. Again, something you don't see in a feudal society. Because in a feudal society, land is sort of maybe, not really owned, but used by a family. And when the head of a household dies, the land stays within that family. There's nothing that changes. In England, we had land that we had very, very strong land titling. Anyone who knows, some of you will know, we were talking about it last night at dinner, Hernando de Soto's excellent book on the mystery of capital. Does anyone know that? About the importance of land titling. It's an incredible, for the development of capital, a really first-class book. But the point is, and this isn't, sometimes when I talk about how England's different, it sounds very arrogant. There's nothing we did to, I'm not responsible for it. It's just the way things developed. But we had very, very strong land ownership rights, and we had very, very strong land titling. That's partly because we didn't have feudalism, so land was owned by an individual. There was an individual that owned that piece of land. We also had very bureaucratic system, which meant that everything was registered. Everything was registered, so land titles were registered. And it's really interesting, or at least it's interesting to me, and all these things tie together, but you look at the land registry in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and there's a wonderful book. Well, I'm not recommending anybody read this, but it's a path-breaking book by Ellen McFarland. It's called The Origins of Individualism in England, which is an odd title because he's talking mostly about land titling, land ownership, and land transfers. and you look at the land sales that were all registered, every single land transfer was registered, and a majority of land sales went to people outside the family. Now, that might seem like an odd thing for me to say, but the majority of land sales went to people outside the family. Completely different from the feudal society in England, where you didn't even have land sales, but land transfers stayed within the family. And so what happened in England was you had a very, very active market in land and land transfers. Now, not only were most of those transfers outside of the family, a lot of those land sales went to people from distant parts of the country. And so that suggests to us that there was a lot of mobility. Another thing that suggests there was a lot of mobility is looking at the death records in churches. And you see that so-and-so died, but he was born somewhere else. So-and-so died, but he was, he came from another place. And these places were often a long way away from England. Now, that's something that's changed in England, by the way, and it changed in the Elizabethan period when they introduced poor laws, which required people who didn't have a job, required them to go back to their village of birth, and they required the villagers to support those people. So you had a period in the medieval time where you had very, very strong mobility, population labor mobility, to a period in the Elizabethan of the 16th century where you had much less mobility. We had, secondly, we had a legal system. Oh, I've talked about that. And then land ownership. Okay. So why was England different? And there were a lot of reasons. One is we obviously had slavery in the pre-Roman period, not obviously, but we had slavery in the pre-Roman period, and then when the Romans invaded England, they continued slavery. But soon after the Romans left, we ceased to have slavery in England. The slavery was when we had invaders, whether they were Vikings or Scottish or Welsh, would come into England, capture people, take them out. But we no longer had slavery inside England. And in fact, it was outlawed by William the Conqueror. That's in the 11th century, when he conquered England. And the council in 1102, Church Council of England, issued a decree saying, "Let no one dare hereafter to engage in the infamous business of selling men like animals." In the continental Europe, in the feudal system, you had slavery continue a long time more than that, but then the feudal system changed slavery into serfdom, and in truth, in practice, there wasn't an awful lot of difference between slavery and serfdom. But we didn't have serfdom, we didn't have feudalism, we didn't have serfdom. Laborers were free, independent, autonomous people. Now, workers would often search for a lord, and this is an important point. We see in all these Robin Hood movies, and I'm a big fan of Robin Hood, when, the man dies, in comes the sheriff and the sheriff's men, and they throw the woman out, and they take all the goods and chattel back to the castle, right? Take the cow back with them and leave the poor people alone. But let's just look at that logically. A laborer would look for a lord for protection and for support. And the support was often the provision of a house, as well as maybe some animals, maybe some farming equipment. And in return, the laborer worked the land and gave some of that land to the lord. The word lord is derived from an Anglo-Saxon word, Laford, which is Hlaford, which means loaf giver. So the lord is the person that provides for the workers. And in England, without serfdom, a man could leave his lord anytime he wanted. Right? He wasn't tied to his lord. He could leave his lord anytime he wanted, as long as the property of the Lord was returned. When you leased a farm from a landlord, from a lord, you got what was called a principalia, which was a list of everything that was the Lord's that he was allowing you to use. And it would include pots and pans and a bed maybe, and animals and so on. And those had to be returned when you left the property. And frankly, that's not a lot different from what it is today. When I moved to Puerto Rico and I leased an apartment, the landlady gave me 4 pages which listed, 6 white plates of 8-inch diameter and 4 plates of this, and I was expected to leave them when I left. And so in England, a family could leave his lord so long as you return the lord's property. King Athelstan, who was the first king of the Saxons in the early 10th century, decreed, "Let no lord obstruct this." So again, this freedom of movement and the autonomy of the workers, completely different from the feudal system. Now I know I'm running out of time here. Okay. So another major difference was that in England, as far back as the 10th century, the king was not absolute. We have an expression in England of the king in parliament. So the king ruled in and through parliament, and regal decrees had to be enacted in parliament. That included tax levies. Now, the parliament was not the result of one man, one vote. Obviously, in the 10th and 11th centuries, it was a group of very few nobles. But the point is that the king was not an absolute king. And that was true in England all the way back to the 10th century. A new tax, usually to fight a war, that's what taxes were normally for, was levied in England every couple of years, which is far less frequently than such taxes were levied in Europe. And the reason, obviously, is that Parliament had to agree to the tax, and Parliament was agreeing to tax itself. And so it was a little bit reluctant to agree to those taxes. Now, in Europe, because of a huge landmass and because of the disparate peoples within that landmass, kings, local nobles would frequently raid villages for taxes. They would just raid villages for taxes as often as 2 or 3 times a year. That brought with it, obviously, not just the loss of income, of capital, but it brought destruction, and it prevented the accumulation of capital. Because in England the taxes were far fewer, and they only came every couple of years at most, then that allowed more capital, more accumulation of private capital. In addition, in England, because it's an island, most of our wars were fought against foreign people, either the Scots, the Irish, from the 11th century onwards, or the French. An army would be raised and they would immediately go to the foreign part. And so we didn't have a system of, you didn't see soldiers being billeted in villages the way you did in Europe, which again led to a more peaceful situation. Another difference between England and Europe that social anthropologists think may be very important is that wild animals were virtually eliminated from England by the 11th century. Unlike most of Europe, where you had wild boars and wolves and bears. Now, this is very important if you think about it, because in England, one shepherd could have a bunch of sheep and take them out to a field. He could leave them on that field all day long without fear of wild animals attacking his flock, and he could leave them out there all night, again, without fear of wild animals attacking his sheep, his herd. In Europe, you had to have 3 or 4 shepherds guarding your flock during the day, And each night you had to bring the sheep into an enclosed area to protect them. Now that was, think about it, a lot of labor that could have been expended, and in England was expended, on more fruitful activities. In England, that led to the development of English wool industry that laid the foundation of English wealth in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Now, I'll come to the conclusion soon. Farmers, yeomen, I talked about the market economy, would take their produce to town. We have evidence that it was not a barter society, not that I have anything against barter, but they would take their produce to town, they would sell them for coins, and with the coins, they would buy other goods, come back home with the other goods that they've bought, and hopefully some money left over, again, which led to the development of the accumulation of capital. So this led to the development of market towns, again, where farmers would take their produce. Whereas in Europe, in the feudal society, typically a farming family would try to produce everything they needed. They'd have a cow if they were rich, they'd have some chickens, they'd have a sheep, they'd have a field of wheat, and they'd do everything they needed to sustain the one family themselves. In England, early on, you had a very high degree of specialization. This led to social mobility. So rather than being a self-sustaining farmer in a village, the farmer would travel to market, as I say, sell his goods, make bargains, meet a spouse, and the spouse might be from a different village further away. So a lot of social interaction and social mobility. The farmer was autonomous, and his sons and daughters could move up in the social ladder. And I'll just give a quote here, if I can find it. Maybe I can't find it, but Richard of Wallingford in 1330. He went to university at Oxford, he studied mathematics. He was the son of a blacksmith, which was not a very high social standing. He was the son of a blacksmith, and he became the abbot of St. Albans. St. Albans was the most famous and wealthiest abbey in England in the 1300s. So the son of a blacksmith became the abbot of Albans, and he wrote, "I was lifted from the dung to sit among princes." And that was literally true. And, you know, when we think of England today, we often think of a monarchy, we think of social classes. And I think, frankly, one of the reasons that the monarchy has survived in England, and one of the reasons that social classes have survived in England, is because they never were as rigid and as hostile, if you like, as they were under the feudal system. And so there wasn't the antagonism towards class, because in fact there was a lot of social mobility. So I've sort of rambled around a bit, but what I'm trying to get at is that in England in the Middle Ages, you had farmers who were autonomous. They were not owned by the Lord. They were free to move. You had a great sense of individualism because of the common law. And you had a free market economy, basically. And all of that changed in the period post the Reformation, unfortunately. It moved backwards. But if not a libertarian paradise, it was a period of a great degree of liberty and a great degree of individualism. Thank you.
Thank you.